when I think about lobbyists, I often think of like, the smoking industry or something god awful like that. But one of the things that he talked about that I think is useful to kind of take away is, and you heard him say something to this effect multiple times, which is a big part of his role is to educate the legislators, right? So the legislators didn't understand at kind of a emotional level the amount of emotional trauma that is happening in our emergency departments when you have psychiatric patients stuck in an ED for days or weeks, and there's no place for them to go. There's no proper place for them to go. A group of you tuned into our conversation with the CNO of Parkland Medical Center, and we talked about this same issue, right? So she was saying, I think if I remember correctly, she was saying they had like kids who were having pediatric psychiatric issues were in an adult ED with no place to go, right? Because there were no pediatric psych beds for them to go to. And so she was, they wanted to, and so these poor kids were in paper gowns, right? In an ED with a bunch of adults running around for days, right? And what a traumatic thing for the kids already having a behavioral health crisis, and then pile on top of that, having them in a completely inappropriate environment, right? Where they probably feel even more vulnerable and normal. So the idea of, the story I kind of reiterated for him, because I remember him telling it a number of years ago, was, when they're trying to address this, they like brought a legislator, state legislator to Concord Hospital and had him walk through the ED and see, here's, Mr. Jones, he's been here for 4 days. He's having a major psychotic break, and this is where he has to stay in an area that is not, conducive to psychiatric treatment with minimal capability, right? And so a legislator might be thinking about that in the abstract, like, okay, we have X number of people in the ED stuck in EDs that have psychiatric issues. If you hear that in the abstract, you're like, all right, yeah, but what else we have is we have to build a bridge over here, and we have to do, because if you're a legislator, you're not just worrying about healthcare, you're also worrying about education, you're also worrying about roads and bridges, and you're worrying about the environment, you're worrying about, there's all these different things. And so any one interest group is competing for attention from the legislator, and the way they're competing to educate the legislator about the reality of the situation, right? So one way to really drive home the need is to say, come on into my hospital and see how these people are suffering because we don't have the capacity to take care of them. And that's very powerful. And so lobbyists, on the one hand, sure, there are dirty lobbyists that do nasty things and, pay bribes and whatever. Those exist. I don't think Steve is one of them. But the fact of the matter is, the legislative process actually relies on lobbyists to educate the legislators. They actually perform an important function in our system. So, and so are there lobbies that have a lot of money and a lot of influence, and maybe they cause legislation to be passed that's in their interest? Absolutely, right? Hospitals have a very large organized lobbying system, the AHA, and then we have all these state level. So they are, Steve, his job is to get laws passed that favor the hospital association. We have the medical association, which represents physicians and their interests, which sometimes overlap with the hospital association and sometimes run counter to the hospital association's interests, right? We have the nurses association, which represents the interests of nurses, right? Sometimes those three organizations align, and sometimes all three of them are going in different directions, trying to establish different things. So like the violence, he mentioned, he only briefly talked about it, but one of the big issues in healthcare right now is violence in the workplace, in particular ED, kind of emergency department, and in particular against nurses. So you have, somebody gets admitted to the ED that you don't know what's, like they walk in and you don't know who they are, what they're, you don't know if they're on drugs, you don't know if they're having a psychotic break, you don't know, right? And sometimes those people become suddenly violent in an unexpected way, or they might just be under a great deal of emotional strain. Maybe their kid's hurt and they don't know what to do, and they are looking for somebody to lash out against. And you've got a nurse coming by and somebody, decides that's the person, they're going to take all their anger out on at that moment. So this is a problem because on the one hand, what do you do to somebody who is maybe having a psychotic break and hurts a nurse? What do you do with that? Like you can't, I mean, they're having a mental, they're literally having a mental breakdown. You can't, what do you do about the drunk person that comes in, the person that's on drugs, the person, and so on. So it's a challenge. And so there you would see the hospital association working with the nurses association to try to come up with a mechanism. But you could imagine on the one hand, maybe their interests aligning. The hospital association definitely wants a safe work environment, because if you don't have a safe work environment, you can't get employees. On the other hand, the nurses association might want more punishment, more, something harder on. And I don't actually know the arguments of this, but I'm just trying to imagine some ways they may align and sometimes they may divide, right? And so it's just a whole slew of issues. We've talked about reimbursement for physicians through Medicare, right? And you guys did the calculations for how the RVUs get paid. Well, if we increase reimbursement, Medicare reimbursement for physicians, that might come at the cost of Medicare reimbursement for hospitals, because there's kind of a limited pool of funds. So that's where you might have competition between those two, or those two groups, interest groups. So we see that, and then get the pharmaceutical industry, and on and on and on. So it's a really interesting field, and it's an important one. And the work that folks like Steve do is really important. All right, how am I going to do this? I'm just going to fix my display here real quick. Finish up. Any other thoughts about what you saw? Observations? No? Anything you learned that was interesting? Did you say something that was interesting, struck you as interesting? All right. So if you're an HMP major, like you said, they sponsor an internship every year. They pay. So that's one of our paid internships. So if you're an HMP major, you can spend a summer at the hospital association, and they'll say, well, what are you interested in? I mean, we had a guy that was there last year who's like, I'm really interested in healthcare finance. So they have a CFO round table where they have all the CFOs from all of the hospitals, and they meet once a month or something. And so the student got to sit in on all those meetings, and then he got to work on projects around finance that were being advocated for by the hospital association. So they're a great group. The executive vice president is an HMP grad. One of the other vice presidents is an HMP grad. I think the director of financial affairs is an HMP grad, and then one of the analysts is there's only like 12 people in the organization, and about half of them are HMP grads, which is kind of cool. So it's a neat organization and great opportunity to get some exposure. All right, so let's wrap up. I've got 20 minutes to wrap up a few slides. So we've been talking about the three legs of federal government, and these are typically replicated in most of the states at the state level. And so we talked about the legislature, the regulatory agencies, which are part of the executive, and then we talk and how each of these make law, right? So the legislature actually passes law, but those laws tend to be like outlines, basically. That's kind of how I think of it, as like somebody, guys ever do like, well, of course, like a coloring book. Like a law is a lot like a coloring book. It's got outlines, and then, it's got a picture, a general picture. And then you pick up the coloring book and you like fill in the, the colors and the detail. That's a lot like how law actually works. Like the legislature, the Congress passes a law that has kind of a broad structure, but all the specifics of how those laws are actually going to be implemented. And the example I was using was the Office of Minority Health. And I showed you some of the fairly general language, like we're going to have an Office of Minority Health. It's going to give out grants. It's going to have a, okay, how's it going to give out grants? How much money is it going to have? Well, that Congress actually decides how much money, but what's the process going to be for granting the grants, right? It said, the Office of Minority Health is going to work to improve the health of minorities. Okay, what kind of, what does that mean? How are we going to actually do that? So that coloring book, if you imagine, like this outline of, generally speaking, like this is what we want you to do. Okay, now we pass that over to the agencies. So HHS, here's the general outline of what we want you to do. We want you to work on minority health. We're going to authorize you to put together an office, and here are the general things we want you to work on. And then the Health and Human Services has to fill in all the coloring, right? All the details. And sometimes those details are instructive to the community that the regulations apply to. So this one's maybe not as good an example. Office of Minority Health is not as good an example, but if Congress passes a law saying to the FDA, we want you to regulate the production of generic drugs in a particular way, then the FDA says, okay, we're going to build these policies, and this is how these are the specifics, drug companies, of how you're going to actually do the thing that the law says you have to do. Those instructions then carry the force of law. And they weren't written by congressmen, they were written by people inside the agency. And so those rules go through a rulemaking process that gets public comment, and there's a bunch of stuff that happens. So it's not like an arbitrary process, but that's where that rulemaking process, where the specifics of the coloring in of the details, that's where your lobbyists like Steve come in and start saying, hey, no, regulatory agency, we really think it should be done this way. And then sometimes they succeed, but of course there's usually a lobby on the other side saying we want it to go the other way. And so there's a process. So regulatory agencies create regulations that then carry the force of law as well. And then finally, judge-made law, the judiciary, right? The US, and because the US carries, the legal system in the US is spun out of the British legal system. And the British and US legal system are called common law systems. The alternative is a civil law system. So US, Great Britain are common law systems. France is a civil law system, and there's other European countries. I think Germany is also civil law. I mean, I'm not an expert in this area. The difference is civil law gives predominance to legislative made law. So laws come into existence primarily, though not exclusively, primarily through the legislature passing specific laws. The common law tradition is and so so civil law is more top down in its structure, in the sense that the government says these are the laws, and then it gets implemented and the courts work out the details. Common law system is more of a bottom up. It looks at traditions and understandings that are maybe cultural, that if you have a dispute with your neighbor, you bring that to a judge. The judge says something like, for example, here's a simple example, and it has nothing to do with healthcare, but imagine you have a tree, right, on the edge of, and it's your tree, but it's on the edge of your yard, and it overhangs your neighbor's lawn. Like maybe there's a fence, and so it overhangs the fence, right? So in the fall, the leaves fall off your tree. Some of them land in your yard, some of them land in your neighbor's yard. Whose responsibility is it to clean up the leaves? I think this is no big deal thing. In the United States, your neighbor cleans up the leaves that fell off your tree because they're in his or her yard, right? My understanding is, from having had a lot of friends who are stationed in Germany in the military, is if you don't get your butt over to your neighbor's yard to clean up the leaves from your tree that fell into his yard, he will be very angry at you, because the understanding is that it was your tree that put the leaves in his yard and it's your mess, right? So the tradition, so what under common law does is they would say, if you then were like, I'm not cleaning the leaves in your yard. That's your yard. You clean the leaves. And your neighbor's like, that's your tree that put the leaves in my yard. Now we're like, we're gonna have a fight about it, or we could go to see the judge. And the judge would say, in the United States, the judge would say, the tradition is that in our country, it's your yard, it's your mess, it's your problem. Your neighbor is not obligated to clean up those leaves. And there's obviously, if there was a lawyer in here, they'd probably be able to tell you 47 different exceptions to that, but that's the general rule, right? And then in Germany, if you were under a common law, they would be like, well, the tradition is that it's your tree, it's your mess, you have to clean up your neighbor's yard, right? So there are two different answers. This has a lot of effect in states, for example, where you have livestock. So not so much around here, but say out in the Midwest, where you have livestock like cattle that's roaming around. If I'm in, say, Iowa, and I have cattle, and then you have a farm and you are growing wheat, if my cattle roll on into your over onto your farm because they're like, hey, that wheat looks tasty, and they eat your wheat, you lose a whole bunch of money. So the only way to, and since you can't tell the cattle, don't do that, cattle, they're not going to listen, they're not that smart. The only way to keep them from doing that is to put a fence up, right? So whose responsibility is it to put the fence up to keep the cattle out? Is it your responsibility as a cattle owner, or is it the responsibility of the farmer to put the fence, or is it the responsibility of the farmer to put up the fence to protect his or her crops? And so the answer is, it kind of depends on where you are in the United States. There's different traditions and different understandings, and some of those evolve out of other factors. But the way common law resolves those things is you have you over time, you have a series of arguments in court, and those judges' opinions create a body of understanding that is legally enforceable. So over time, we'd have an opinion that creates a precedent, right? That says, it's the cattle owner's responsibility to fence the cattle in versus it's the farmer's, the wheat farmer's responsibility to fence the cattle out. And then that becomes a pretty significant, unlike the leaves, this is a pretty significant financial issue, right? If the cattle wander into my farm and eat all my crops, I'm losing a whole lot of money. So it becomes and it's also expensive to build a fence. So whose responsibility that is? So that's an example of common law where a tradition gets kind of built up through a series of court decisions that then build up a law. So most law in the United States was not written by a legislature. It was actually from the top down. It was actually written by it more emerged as a result of a series of court cases and court fights about who had the right to what. So that's the difference between common law and civil law. And obviously both systems have a little bit of both, right? France has courts, they make decisions that refine the civil law. All right. So, so getting into, this is in your book, so I'm going to kind of skip through it fairly quickly because there's a few other things I want to touch on. But you have a bunch of different kinds of policy tools. So we've talked about regulatory tools, right, which are typically set by executive agencies. And we have allocative tools. So these are ways of setting rules, right, regulatory rules for how people are going to behave. And so this might be This goes more to the idea of like the fence in, fence out. That's a regulation. Like it decides who's responsible for something and how they're going to go about doing that. In the healthcare industry, that is, insurance companies, insurance agencies, so agencies, not agents itself, but the state agency that manages insurance makes decisions about how insurance can be sold in what minimums and maximums and so forth. We have licensing boards. I'm on one of them for nursing home administrators. We make decisions about who can be a nursing home administrator and who cannot be, right? Those are regulatory tools for policy. Then we have allocative tools, which says, hey, we got taxes, we got money, we've got resources. How are we going to hand those things out? And one variation on this is to kind of focus more on infrastructure. So specifically on distributive policies, which give benefits broadly to broad populations. So things like, hey, we're going to fund research on mRNA, right? So basic research, like what's mRNA and how does it work? The federal government's going to give money through the National Institute of Health for research on mRNA. That benefits anybody, right? Anybody and everybody, because it gets published that basic research gets published in a scientific journal, and scientists around the world can then look at it and work on it and develop ideas from it. That's an example, right? Of where no one in particular is benefiting from the fact that we now understand mRNA better than we did before, right? Other examples like building a road or building a hospital. Building a hospital, helping to build a hospital benefits a community as a whole. It does benefit a particular community, so it's in some ways more specific, but it generally creates capacity. So distributive policies generally create capacity for the community to then use and build on itself. Redistributive policies, on the other hand, explicitly benefit specific individuals and populations. So Medicaid is a good example of a redistributive policy. It takes money collected from the general population and it funnels it to a specific population, in this case, poor people, right? Or Medicare. Medicare takes money from the general population and gives it to old people. So there's a specific population. Public housing is another example, right? That's kind of a public health, perspective. So the key to remember is, at the end of the day, all the money comes from the taxpayers. The question is really, does it get funneled to a particular group, or does it get given to enhance the overall well-being of the larger community, whether that's the nation, the world, the state, or the locality. We've talked about this, the idea of public interest versus public choice. So I will not reiterate this, but the idea of public interest is kind of, hey, the government, we have these problems we have these market failures where not enough people can afford healthcare or whatever. We're going to just turn that over to the government because people in the government always look out for the interests of the people. And in particular, one of the things that we focus on with market failure is this idea of public goods. So you might hear somebody say, well, education is a public good because it's provided by, taxpayer money, right? So public education, because it's funded by the government, is a public good. That is a misuse of it is not the meaning that I'm using here. Public goods in economics and political philosophy has a particular meaning. So a public good is not necessarily something that's provided by the government. I could produce a public good, right? I'm not a government, I work for the government, I guess, in a way, but you could produce a public good, right? So what is a public good? Well, it's a non-rival, non-excludable good. What does that mean? Well, a rival good, so two things here. A rival good is if an additional user begins to use the good, then there's less of it for everybody else. So for example, if Sean had a cheeseburger and he's sitting over there eating his cheeseburger, and I'm like, hey, Sean, that cheeseburger looks really good. And I grab it and I take a bite out of it. Sean now has less cheeseburger and probably is like, that's nasty. I don't want to, you can keep it. Right. But either way, right. If Sean and I, if there's one cheeseburger and Sean says, hey, Professor Bonneke, you want to share this with me? And he cuts it in half. He now has a half a cheeseburger and I have a half a cheeseburger. So the value of the cheeseburger has been diminished by the fact that there's a second person gnawing on it now, right? So there are goods like that that diminish in value. And then there are goods that don't diminish in value. So for example, a song, right? You got a really great song. If Angela was to play her favorite song for us, you know, what did that be? Let me think. Rhinestone Cowboy or something like that. So Angela's like, I really want to share this with all of you. And she plays it, right? The fact she's playing that song, we're all sitting here listening to it. If one more person came into the room, it wouldn't diminish the value of the song, right? So music, so playing music, assuming that you all want to hear Angela's music, right? Which obviously we all would want to, but there's no rivalry to that, right? We could have a third or a fourth person come into the room and there would be no diminishment of the value of the music. Right? Radio is a classic example. Once you put out a radio signal, right, into the airwaves, having one more person come into the area and pick up the radio signal does not diminish the ability of everybody else to share in that good. So that's a radio signal is an example of a non-rival good, right? So rival goods are goods that if one more person consumes it, the value goes down for everybody else. Non-rival goods, the value does not go down as a result. And then excludable is, can I keep somebody from consuming the good? So going back to the cheeseburger, if I like Sean sitting there eating his cheeseburger, I'm like, Sean, that looks like a good cheeseburger. I think I might like a piece of it. He's like, right, no, it's my cheeseburger. We'll have to fight that, fight about that. So he could, hey, no, that's gross, first of all, and no, you can't have my cheeseburger, right? So excludable means you can stop somebody from participating in it. But if I set up a radio tower and I start blasting out, radio waves, start putting out a radio signal with music, with Angela's music on it, right? She can't stop anybody from listening to it who happens to be in the area. So radio is a classic example of a non-rival, non-excludable good. So that is an example of a public good. So when I said I could make a public good, is if I bought a radio tower and I started playing Angela's playlist over that radio tower, that would be a public good in the sense that it's non-rival and not excludable. Cheeseburgers are rival and excludable, right? As is most direct care medicine. So doctor's visits are rival and excludable. And then we have some examples of non-rival, non-excludable, rival and non-excludable things. And that would include things like a public park, right? So you have a public park, it's free for us all to use it, but as more people come in, right? So you can't keep anybody out because by law, it's a public park, anybody can come in. But as more people start to come into your public park, it's like Hampton Beach, right? You can't keep, nobody can be told, yeah, you can't go to Hampton Beach. But if you go on a Saturday in late July, it's like it's shoulder to shoulder kind of crowd, right? It's gross. So that is an example of a rival non-excludable. I'm going to finish this up next week because I've got a few more slides. So we'll wrap that up because that's enough. It's important enough. Have a good weekend, and I'll be grading your exams over the weekend. I'm just behind on a bunch of stuff.